Hi everyone, welcome to the Inkspot, brought to you by the Pen Habit. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Kaweco or Kaweco Paradise Blue. Nice, lovely turquoise color. I'm going to say Kaweco because that's how Stephen Brown says it in his videos, and since he speaks German and I don't, I'm going to pretend that he knows how this is pronounced better than I do. I didn't bother asking the company, but I assume it's Kaweco. Mentioned lovely turquoise ink, nice glass bottle here with kind of a plastic top. It's got a paper tape that when it comes in its box that keeps the bottle closed. You have to break the tape to open it up. So nice, lovely bottle here. I believe this is the same shape that the Pelikan inks come in. But in this review, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write the name of the pen that I'm using on a couple of pieces of paper, maybe a quick writing sample, on Rhodia and on Tomoe River paper, so you can see how the ink behaves. And then I'm going to go over my full written review and then direct you over to penhabit.com to look at all of the photos that go along with, because I do a much more in-depth review, etc. So let's start off, though, with the foamatography, my faux chromatography. So the way I do these is I take a line of ink, I run the line of ink right here with a syringe, and then I dip this end in water, and I hang it in a very tall vase for about half an hour. And over that time, the water will wick up the paper towel and distribute the ink pigment along the way. So unsurprisingly, for a turquoise ink, obviously there are a lot of blue and green components in this ink. And you can see here, nice, I actually love this blue up here at the top. It's like, now I need Kaweco to make an ink that color. Nice, rich green there. And over here, you start to see just a hint of a yellow, which is something you see on Rhodia paper, but not on some of the other papers. You see a little bit of a kind of a yellowish undertone where the ink pools. And then we've got kind of a teal color throughout here. So that's kind of how the breakdown of some of the ink pigmentation. So let's see what it looks like when it's written. So today's pens are going to be the Sailor 1911 large. And this is a medium fine nib, although because it's a Japanese nib, it is much finer than any fine nib I have in my collection otherwise. So you can see nice line, no shading, which is not uncommon with this with this smaller nib tip sort of thing. Coming up next, we have the Lamy Vista. Now this pen does tend to run just a little dry. You can start to see just a little bit of extra shading there, but this is an ink that I think really deserves a juicy pen, because the color, which you'll see here next on the next pen, which is a Lamy All-Star, really richens and deepens once you get a wet nib or a broader nib. And you start to see more in-depth shading, much more saturated looking in these broader nibs. Next after that is a fairly new pen to my collection, and this is the Ranga Model 3. And this is a 1.1 millimeter stub, which is quite lovely. And finally, and I need to open my ink bottle here because I did not fill this pen. I'm just doing a dip right now. And I'll leave it pretty wet so you can see what a super wet writing looks like. But this is the, no, it's not as I was hoping. TWSBI VAC 700 with a 1.5 millimeter stub. And let me just go back to the medium nib. Actually, I'm going to use the broad nib for this one so you can see, but just do a nice All right. So on this Rhodia paper, the ink performs well. It performs fairly well, and we'll talk about all of the specifics. You get some shading. It's not the most highly shaded ink I've ever used. It's not the most saturated ink I've ever used. As I mentioned, this ink likes a wet pen, certainly. But it's fairly smooth writing, feels moderately lubricated, dries in a decent amount of time. But you can see here, I mean, it just, to me, does not have as much personality in the fine nib as it does in the wider nibs. So move that out of the way and then switch over to our good old friend Tomoe River, and we'll do the same thing once again. This is the Sailor 1911 large, medium fine. The Lamy Vista in medium. Lamy All-Star. Broad. The Ranga Model 3. 1.1 millimeter stub. And the TWSBI. Back 700 in a 1.5 millimeter stub. So, and I don't know if the video will pick this up at all. Nope, that's the wrong one. You can see here are the two side by side. This is the cream colored paper. This is the white paper on the left here. And I actually feel like this is a little more saturated on the Rhodia white paper than it is on the cream colored paper from Tomoe River. I just feel like the ink feels a little darker. And maybe it's just the contrast level, but you can see, especially here on this broad line between the two, I feel like this has a much, but a slightly richer tone. So this is an ink I personally prefer on white paper. So that being said, let's dive into the specs here. So this is my new ink review form. So going through the scores on Rhodia paper, no bleed, pretty good color, no feathering, fairly lubricated, fairly saturated, some shading, but not as much as I like on some of these lighter inks. If I'm going to use a light ink, I want it to be pretty highly shaded, and this one is moderately shaded. Sheen, there's almost no sheen to speak of here, just tiny little hints of a dark blue-ish edge around some of the pooling. And show through, very, very little show through. At 10 seconds here, you can see on the dry times, there's just little wisps of color. And then by 15 and 20 seconds, it's almost completely dry, which is actually on Rhodia paper pretty good. The 1, 2, and 3 pass, like I said, you can see some shading, especially between 1 and 2, but between 2 and 3, it's a little bit less. And you can see some of that yellow coloration in the pooling areas that I was telling you about right there. And then finally, wrapping up with the water test here, not terribly water resistant. So at least on the Rhodia paper, don't expect to be seeing a lot of water resistance. On the cheap copy paper, so let's talk through this just a little bit. Bleed through, let me turn the paper over and show you what that looks like. This is not an ink that does well on cheap copy paper. You can see there is a lot of bleed through. And all of this text here was actually done with the Lamy Vista, which is the medium nib, and runs dry. So even on, this is the Sailor, which is that super fine nib, or the fine medium nib, there was bleed through there. This ink is just an ink that bleeds on cheap paper. Color, again, on the white paper, I think I like the color a little better than I do on cream colored paper. Feathering, there is a fair bit of feathering. It's not unbearable, but there's a fair bit, and so it's down at a 4 out of 10. Lubrication, it feels less lubricated, but then again, this is a less smooth paper. Saturation, a little more saturated than on Tomoe River, about the same as on Rhodia. Shading, even less than there is on Rhodia. There's no sheen to speak of, and when it's not bleeding through, there's a fair bit of show through. Again, you can see a fairly big jump between the first pass and the second pass on the test, not much between the second and the third. And on the water test, this actually surprised me. It actually did better on the cheap paper than it did on the Rhodia. I guess it didn't really totally surprise me because Rhodia paper is coated so the ink doesn't absorb in quite as easily. And finally, Tomoe River, and this is our cream colored paper. So you can see here, this isn't what I would consider sheen necessarily, but it's got some really interesting edges around the coloring where the ink pooled here, like nice dark blue edges. Bleed through, there is a little bleed through. You can see on the third pass here and up here, there's tiny little bits of bleed through, which is really unusual on Tomoe River paper. It only happened when I was doing the swabs, so I would probably not use a flex pen on Tomoe River paper with this ink, but because it's really hard to get ink to bleed through Tomoe River. That doesn't generally happen. Color, as I mentioned, I don't like it as much in the cream-colored Tomoe River as I do on the white-colored of the other two. No feathering, nice lubrication, a little less saturated feeling. Better shading, though, on the other two. Because the ink doesn't absorb in quite as much, you get what I think is nicer shading. Like I mentioned, tiny little bit of, it's not really sheen, but for lack of a better term, I'm giving it a couple points there. And then not much in the way of show-through. The ink does, again, still dry fairly quickly. On Tomoe River, 15 seconds is actually quite good. So this ink will dry fairly quickly on whatever paper you use. Then we see probably here we didn't get a lot of difference between the first and the second pass, but more between the second and third. So you can see here that might be, this is, again, if you're going to use Tomoe River paper with this ink, you're going to want a fairly wet pen. And then the water test, yeah, not so water resistant. So that is my review and walkthrough of the Kaweco Paradise Blue ink, nice lovely turquoise color. To see the rest of the photos and the write-up of this review, please head over to penhabit.com to look at all of that stuff and join the conversation. And we look forward to seeing you next time here on the Pen Habit. Thank you for watching.